Most people don't lose their integrity all at once. They lose it at threshold, in an argument, in a moment of urgency, in a room where everyone else is saying yes. Pressure doesn't destroy character, it reveals what governs it. I'm Kaye McLeod, and this is Integrity Under Pressure, a podcast about self governance, consequence literacy, and how to protect your integrity when willpower isn't enough. Because integrity isn't a personality trait, it's a governance skill. There is a popular idea floating around that ego is the enemy. You hear it everywhere: lose your ego, kill your ego, let go of ego. And on the surface, it sounds wise, except there's one small problem with that advice. You can't actually remove your ego. Your ego is simply the part of you that knows you exist. It is the organizing center of identity. It is what allows you to say, I, I am. Without it, you wouldn't have humility, you wouldn't have confidence, agency. You would mostly just stare at the wall and forget why you walked into rooms, which, to be fair, some of us already do occasionally. But the point is this: the ego is not the problem. The ungoverned ego is the problem because the ego has a job. Its job is to protect identity. Its job is to defend status. Its job is to avoid humiliation. And those instincts are powerful, particularly when pressure enters the room. The moment your ego senses threat, social threat, performance threat, embarrassment, it reacts quickly, often faster than your thinking mind, which means that in certain moments, your ego can make decisions before wisdom has time to speak. And those moments can shape a life. I learned this lesson very early, when I was 7 years old, at my first singing competition. Now, at 7 years old, you don't think of it as a performance psychology event. You'd think of it as a room full of adults staring at you while you try to not to forget the words, which is already an intimidating setup. My aunt was my vocal coach, and in my mind, she was extremely serious about music, which meant there was a lot at stake, at least inside my 7 year old brain. The stage lights were bright, the audience was quiet, the music started, and I began singing. Everything was fine until I approached the high note. Now, if you've ever sang in front of people, you know this moment. That moment when you realize a note is coming and suddenly your brain becomes extremely interested in the possibility of failure. Your thoughts accelerate, your body tightens, your attention leaves the music and moves entirely into your head. Why? Because performance anxiety activates the body's threat response. Adrenaline rises, breathing changes, fine motor control actually decreases, which is extremely inconvenient. When your entire job in that moment is breath control and vocal precision, your body is preparing to outrun a tiger while you're trying to sing a high note. And once you're in your head, the performance begins to collapse, which is exactly what happened to me. I felt the panic rising. I felt the fear of missing the note. I imagined the audience noticing. I imagined my aunt being disappointed. And in that moment, my 7 year old ego did something dramatic. I stopped singing. I threw the microphone and I ran off the stage. Then I climbed a tree, a literal tree, which, if you're analyzing the situation strategically, was probably not the next logical move. But when you're 7 and your ego is trying to escape humiliation, climbing a tree feels like an excellent long term plan. long term plan. From the outside, it probably looked like a complete meltdown. And in many ways, it was. Fear, humiliation, shame, all the emotions that show up when identity feels threatened. But something interesting happened while I was sitting in that tree. Something very small, but very important. A thought appeared, not a dramatic thought, just a quiet realization. I didn't die. Which might sound obvious, but when fear takes over, the brain behaves as if social embarrassment is life threatening. The nervous system treats humiliation like survival danger. And once that realization appeared that the world had not ended, something changed. The fear lost its authority. That day, something inside me recalibrated. My fear of performing on stage died in that tree. Now, that doesn't mean I never felt nervous again, but the catastrophic story disappeared. And that moment taught me something about my ego. My ego often behaves like a dragon, a loud, dramatic creature that believes it is protecting the kingdom. But sometimes the dragon is just overreacting. The dragon sees a threat and starts breathing fire. Except the threat might only be a high note in a children's singing competition, or a meeting where you need to speak, or a difficult conversation with a partner, or a presentation in front of colleagues. The ego interprets those moments as a danger. And when it does, it tries to protect you. And sometimes by attacking, sometimes by withdrawing, sometimes by sabotaging the moment entirely. But the ego is not malicious, it is protective. It simply lacks discernment when it is ungoverned. Psychology research shows that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain, which means your brain doesn't clearly distinguish between a broken arm and a public embarrassment, which explains why embarrassment can feel so overwhelming. Your brain literally experiences it as a threat. But here is where governance becomes important because the ego's instinct is reaction. Governance introduces choice. Governance says, yes, fear is present, but fear does not get to drive. You see this everywhere in adult life. A professional stays silent in a meeting because their ego fears looking foolish. A leader overreacts to criticism because their ego feels attacked. A partner escalates an argument because their ego wants to win. A creator never publishes their work because their ego fears judgment. These are not failures of character. They are moments where the ego is ungoverned, where fear has temporarily taken the wheel. And the fascinating thing about ego reactions is that they feel incredibly convincing in the moment. The ego always believes it is justified, always, which is why ungoverned ego can cause enormous damage. Careers, relationships, teams, entire organizations. History is full of leaders whose egos made decisions their wisdom never would have approved. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote something remarkably simple. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. That statement contains a quiet but profound truth. The ego cannot control what happens, but it can influence how you respond. And governance determines which responses appears. Without governance, ego reacts. With governance, ego becomes useful. Because the ego also contains courage, ambition, creativity, drive. Every meaningful human achievement contains ego energy. The difference is whether that energy is governed or unleashed without restraint. Which brings us back to the dragon. In many ancient myths, dragons guard treasure, but they also destroy villages when left unchecked. The hero in those stories doesn't usually kill the dragon, they tame it. They learn how to ride it. Human ego works the same way. Your ego is powerful. It contains your desire to express yourself, your drive to succeed, your willingness to stand up for something. But if that energy is not governed, it can sabotage the very life you are trying to build. The dragon breathes fire at the wrong moment. But when the dragon is trained, it becomes transport, it becomes fuel, power, which means the real work of integrity is not eliminating ego. The work is governing it, recognizing the signals, the tightening in your chest before you speak, the defensive story forming in your mind, the sudden urge to win the argument. Those signals are the dragon waking up. And the moment you notice that signal, you gain a choice. You can react or you can govern. Sometimes governing means pausing. Sometimes it means breathing. Sometimes it means allowing embarrassment to exist without fleeing the stage. Because embarrassment is not fatal. Neither is criticism. Neither is imperfection. Most of the fears the ego tries to protect us from are survivable, which is exactly what 7-year-old me discovered in a tree. I didn't die. And once you know that, the dragon loses some of its power, which leads to a question worth asking yourself, not philosophically, practically. Where in your life does your ego react before your wisdom speaks? In conversations, in leadership, in creative work, in conflict? Because the ego is not the enemy. The enemy is leaving it ungoverned. And integrity begins the moment you learn how to hold the reins. So here's the mirror question I want to leave you with. The next time your ego feels threatened, the next time fear rises, the next time embarrassment appears, will you let the dragon burn the village or will you learn to ride it? If this episode did anything, let it be this. You saw the pattern. Pressure is not the problem. The question is whether you govern yourself inside it. Hold that and decide what you're no longer willing to do on autopilot. Because integrity isn't a personality trait, it's a governance skill. I'll see you on the next episode.